Welcome to the 2024 Marshall Forum. I'm a 2002 Marshall Scholar, getting my dates mixed up. And on behalf, let me thank the Marshall Commission. Let me thank the Clark Center for Global Markets, of which I'm a co-director. My colleague Amir Sufi is a former co-director. My colleague Anil Kashyap runs it with me at the moment. I'm Eric Budish. I'm a 2002 Marshall Scholar and economics professor right here at the University of Chicago, where I've been since 2009. And like I said last night, the purpose of the Marshall Forum is to come together to consider strategic and economic issues that are relevant to the US-UK relationship in the spirit of and in honor of the Marshall Plan. And this being the University of Chicago, we're going to have a special focus in this year's forum on economics and financial markets. So the topic of this panel is Chicago economics. I think we provocatively titled it the new Chicago economics. So Chicago economics, past and present, Chicago economics, caricature and reality, whatever you want to call it, it's fine. So Keynes famously said, to quote, practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. And a lot of those economic ideas have come from right here at the University of Chicago. Chicago economics is often caricatured as an extreme free market ideology. Even if you read it, Milton Friedman, though, he talks about the importance of the government as umpire and the importance of the government in setting the, quote, rules of the game. And if you spend time with Hayek and Constitutional Liberty, he grapples for 600 odd pages on the role of government and laws in maximizing liberty. So I wanted to use this panel to reflect on the Chicago School of Economics and how it manifests in the present day. And together with me are two just very distinguished colleagues of mine, Amir Sufi and Luigi Zingales. All three of us live to varying degrees at the intersection of economics and finance. I'm in the micro group at Booth. Amir and Luigi are in the finance group at Booth. Amir Sufi is the Bruce Lindsay Distinguished Service Professor of Economics and Public Policy. He was awarded the Fisher Black Prize in 2017 for Best Financial Economist in the world under 40, and is particularly well known for his research on household debt and the Great Recession, including his book, House of Debt. Luigi is the Robert McCormick Distinguished Service Professor of Entrepreneurship and Finance, former president of the American Finance Association, the director of the Stigler Center at the University of Chicago, host of a podcast, Capitalism, and the author of many articles and books, including Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists and Capitalism for the People. So the way we're going to structure this panel is we'll hear from each of the panelists. I'm going to kind of serve as a panelist and moderator, followed by, we'll hear from each of the panelists for 5-ish minutes, followed by some discussion, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And in good Chicago fashion and in good Marshall scholarship fashion, we hope for a lively discussion and some debate. Feel free to ask questions all over the map. We don't need to be. British politeness is fine, but not mandatory. So without further ado, Amir, why don't you lead us off?
Yeah, well, thank you. First of all, thanks, Eric, for the opportunity to be here, and thank you all for coming. It's early, but it's hot and it's air conditioned, so we'll enjoy it. As Eric said, I'm Amir Sufi. I am in the finance group at Booth. I thought I would just briefly tell you a little bit about myself and then maybe try to tackle this question of what Chicago economics is about. So I do research at the intersection of finance and macro. Always been interested in the core question, which is how does the financial system affect the real economy, consumption, employment, production, and always trying to keep grounded in the real economy as we talk about finance. That's always been my goal in my research. I'm currently working on questions related to the production side of the economy because I do think it's changed a lot in the last 20, 25 years. And I think this, obviously a lot of people are interested in artificial intelligence and large language models and how it will further affect the production process. So that's kind of what I'm focused on right now in my research. In terms of the big picture question of like what defines Chicago economics, is there a new Chicago economics? That's a pretty intimidating question. So let me start with some modesty, which is Chicago actually has an enormous economics community, and it has a lot of differing viewpoints throughout the the different places. And so coming up with like a unified theme is going to be a little bit hard. And I think just to make sure everyone understands what I mean, we have the Department of Economics, we have Booth, we have the Harris School, and we have the law school, all of which, and I apologize if I'm missing anybody, that I probably am, but these are all different places with their own cultures. We interact with each other, so sometimes we bleed into each other. And so when I think about Chicago economics, I really do think from the perspective of Booth, because I've been at Booth my entire academic career since 2005. So coming on 20 years now, I've been at Booth. And when I think about the core themes that define what we try to do at Booth, and I think broadly speaking, Chicago economics, I think of two main themes relative to other places. One is the focus on questions. I think that's something that is, you may be thinking is obvious, but I don't think it is. And I think at Booth and at Chicago in general, we never lose sight of the biggest picture questions in the field of economics. Maybe to a fault, that if someone comes and gives a seminar on what we perceive to be a small question, maybe we all kind of tune out a little bit and aren't even going to focus on the details. So we want to know the answers to big picture questions. How do macroeconomic fluctuations occur? How does the financial system affect the real economy? And we had some promotions in finance this year to tenure, and I could go through them. And all three of the people who we promoted were clearly focused on big picture questions. So that's one thing. Now, I'm sure every economics group in the world is going to say we do too, but I really think that there's something special about Chicago in that regard. And it's closely related to the second main theme, which is a kind of openness. That as long as you're on the same page, that you care about big questions, we're going to be pretty open in listening to what you have to say. And that may be something that's changed over time. I think these two things can be dangerous in their interaction, because a guy like Milton Friedman, I hope not to get struck down from the sky here, but like obviously focused on super big questions, right? And obviously had super compelling arguments on those questions. I think at some point he may have become so convinced of his answers that he wasn't the most open person in the world. And I think we have plenty of evidence, including from David Booth himself, of examples where perhaps presenting in front of Milton Friedman, you didn't get the most open person in the world to new ideas. But I think at Booth especially, we really are quite open. I mean, we saw a couple of papers in the spring quarter with outlandish ideas, and we're like, but on important questions, and we were willing to listen. So then in trying to define that in a little bit more detail, let me tell you what we're not. I think sometimes it's usually easier to see sometimes the counterfactual. And I think where some economic disciplines and disciplines in science in general go wrong is drifting too far from these two principles, which is openness and big questions. And what I think you see in some other places, and I won't be mean and name them, but I do think that if you don't focus on those two questions, you can go in the wrong direction on the following way. First of all, you can become very ideological, right? You can become very wedded to certain ideas and no longer be open to considering other ideas. And that's a very dangerous thing that happens in some economic departments that you can very clearly see throughout history. And maybe they make huge contributions in the short run, but in the long run, that's not a good way of running a group, is to be excessively ideological. And a close twin to that is to be excessively focused on methodology, right? This is a natural corollary, I think, to a lack of openness, is you become more in love with the methodological tools rather than the questions. And I think at Chicago, I've always prided ourselves as only caring about methodology to the degree that it facilitates the answer to the big picture question, and being open to any methodology. But I think you've seen in many economic disciplines, getting too deep into one particularly methodological toolkit, and that ends up detracting from the buildup of just broader knowledge. So those are the kind of main ways I see the new Chicago economics, being focused on questions, being focused on openness, and being a little bit careful about ideology and excessive being wedded to certain kind of methodological tools. And I think it's served us well. I think we've done pretty well sticking to those principles.
Do you want to give, just before we move on to Luigi, do you want to give one example from your own research that you think exemplifies? I'll ask you to be non-modest for a second.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, when we did it, it's interesting because when Atif and I, we started both in the finance group at Booth, we kind of always interested in the real economy. And so when we started doing our research on the importance of household debt, I mean, macro has a very like strong framework in this real business cycle framework, and it's not obvious all macro people are wedded to that, but there are certainly some people who are. And you read that framework in a lot of detail, and it's super important and useful, and it gets you the right first order conditions to think through things. But it's just missing so much, right? And I think you have to be open to thinking about what it's missing. And so there's this great body of research, part of which, you know, Ben Bernanke won the Nobel Prize for, thinking about intermediation frictions. And that was where Atif and I came from. And that's what we thought when we started doing research on the preliminary side of the Great Recession. We were kind of in the boat that, oh, these financial frictions are going to be first order. But I think we were open both on the methodological front and on the question front to kind of quickly figuring out that, like, wow, like this seems to be generated more through household borrowing than financial frictions. Now, of course, they're related to each other, but being open to the idea that actually, like, the financial sector is super important, but when we look at the household sector and how much people are borrowing against their home equity and how much they're spending, and then when the crash happens, how much their decline in consumption ended up being important in driving the dynamics of the recession. We never, of course, were saying Lehman Brothers wasn't important, but I think we were known as the scholars saying, look, Lehman Brothers is important, but let's not forget that households borrowed a ton during the boom, and it's their decline in consumption that's really driving the recession dynamics. And so, again, if you had asked me in 2005 when I just finished my PhD if my main body of research was going to be focused on household borrowing, I mean, my thesis was on syndicated loans and corporate borrowing, I wouldn't have thought that would be the case, but that's where the data led us. That's where the kind of facts seem to go, and so that's where we went.
Yeah, data and big questions. And Luigi, thank you.
So first of all, we always say that we argue all the time, but I agree 100% with what Amir said. And let me only add two things. One, I think the big questions and openness are great. In addition, there is this passion for the data. I think that there is a lot of empirical analysis, and also empirical analysis is now sort of a universal feature. But I like to say to my students, etc., you have to get physical with the data. You have to know the data. It's not just running a tape, it's actually getting the data not every data point because it's impossible at this point, but almost. The other point that I would like to add is really, at least for the Booth component, an enormous tribute to Gene Farmer, because I think that the tolerance we see, and actually people who have known Gene Farmer many years ago maybe have a different view, but I think he was very open-minded to different changes in the profession. He welcomed Dick Taylor at the school. And I remember that as a young assistant professor, I sat through a class of Dick Taylor in which he invited Gene Farmer to debate him in front of the class. Now, I kind of knew that this would be 2 Nobel Prizes in the future. It was pretty obvious, but I think the students did not have that appreciation. And but also how exposed they were. And what was fascinating is at the end of everybody asked who won, and I think, look, I think that Gene is a better debater, but probably Dick was right. But I think that the willingness to expose yourself in front of the ideas, and I think is unique. And there is a joke at Chicago that when you leave the faculty, you lose 15 IQ points. Mm-hmm. And part of it is because what forces you to be on your toes is that no matter who you are, presenting at Chicago is a bit of a pain. And there is no respect for authority in the positive sense. So I love the story that the previous dean was an operation research guy from Stanford, and where we already announced that he would be the dean, but he wanted to come and give a seminar in operation research. And so he gave like a seminar in operation research, and an assistant professor from the last row, he raised his hand and said, oh, this is a very unfortunate assumption. So this is the place where you want to be, a place where the assistant professor can say to the new dean, this is unfortunate. And once I tried this I actually said silly, not unfortunate, but I tried this at the law school at Harvard with Daron Acemoglu, almost the honest mode lost his coolness. People told me I had to apologize the day after, etc. Because the British thing is not really in my gene. The last anecdote, then I'll go into something more serious, is when I was an assistant professor, I presented once in a big conference in Stockholm, and Frank Easterbrook was in the audience and asked a question that I didn't think was that sort of deep. And so I think I treated him with a little bit of condescendence. And then when I stepped down from the podium, I said, he's a US judge. I should actually go and apologize. So I went and apologized. And he was so gracious. He said, don't worry. If you don't have a rough edge, you don't belong to the University of Chicago. And when I told this to my mother, she cried because she understood I found my place. A place where eventually I was normal. But this said, I think that Amir went into the cross-section, and without coordinating, I decided to go on the time series. So on the question of the Chicago school, I actually went and Pro-Market, which is a publication of the Stigler Center, does some historical stuff. And one of the pieces that they published relatively recent is a piece by George Stigler on the Chicago School, in particular, a representative of Chicago School in the 30s and 40s called Henry Simons. And let me read a few things that he said because it's quite interesting. First of all, he said, Henry Simons was the crown princess of that hypothetical kingdom, the Chicago School of Economics. And then he said, the Chicago School has always been a phrase whose accuracy varied inversely to its content. And then described the leading figures in the 30s were Knight, Weiner, Mintz, and Simon himself. And then he said, these guys have been important in forming the present view of the Chicago School, which is mostly represented by Aaron Director and Friedman, and of course he's too modest to himself, but clearly Joe Stigler was in this triad. And by the way, this triad was all trained by Henry Simons. And then he said, the evolution of institutional theories have moved them beyond Simons' positions. So people, we're not in the business of faith. When people say, oh, but you disagree with Milton Friedman, I said, if I wanted to stay in the business of faith, I would stay in Italy. And there is a lot of career there if you want to be religious. But I think that I am in the business of research, and research evolves. However, he said, yet Simon's central goal is as vital and as irresistible today as it was 40 years ago. Now, he writes in 1974, so 50 years ago, so now we are into the 90s. And he says, what is the goal is to devise a decentralized, unpoliticized world in which personal freedom and economic efficiency find wide scope and strong defense. And I think that that's a beautiful sentence for what Chicago is about. And let me sort of end with a piece by Henry Simon himself that say, it seems clear at all events that there is an intimate connection between freedom of enterprise and freedom of discussion, and that political liberty can survive only within an effectively competitive economic system. The great enemy of democracy is monopoly in all its forms. This was Henry Simons. As you can see, the Chicago School has changed over time, and it's normal that changes over time because if you are attached to data and questions, the data change, the word change, the question change. And so what remains is an approach that is the one that Amir described, and also, I think, an ideal, and I think that's the one that Stigler described.
So can I just jump in for a second just on Henry Simons, who I find to be one of the most fascinating historical figures in economics. He probably had multiple big ideas, but I can tell you the one I know best that I've read his book carefully, and just to kind of contrast this view that all Chicago is about getting rid of every regulation and every restriction by the government. One of his very big ideas that some of you may know was narrow banking. He was one of the biggest advocates for narrow banking in the aftermath of the Great Depression. And those of you who don't know what that term means, there was a whole consortium of economists, including Irving Fisher, that were very upset about what they called the ability of the private sector to do money creation, which they blamed for the Great Recession, that the bubble in the 20s was caused by private lending institutions lending too much Sounds pretty familiar, right? And they basically were like, no private sector institution should be allowed to create money out of non-money assets. And that led them to the conclusion, talk about regulation, that no private institution that issues deposits should be able to invest in anything but reserves at the central bank and maybe short-term T-bills. And that sounds like a pretty strong regulation, right? So they wanted to pretty much outlaw commercial banks as they existed. And of course, they weren't successful in that endeavor. The rumor is that they were actually quite close to being successful. In fact, there's a story about, in some of the old literature, about a senator from New Mexico dying in a plane crash. And had he not died, that maybe the FDIC never would have been created. And instead, we would have had narrow banking. But just to give you a sense of a guy like Henry Simons, who's probably one of the most associated with the Chicago School, wanted to completely get rid of commercial banks as we know them today.
That's great. Let me. I want to tell a story, and then I'll go into one thread of research substance. The story is from my first day at the University of Chicago. This is summer of 2009, and I work in an area of research called market design, which I like to think of as designing the rules of the game for markets. One of our colleagues at the University of Chicago is in economic theory, who's a little bit less well known, but also has a Nobel Prize, Roger Myerson, is who first figured out that you could use game theory not just to study an existing game, but to design the optimal rules of the game. And so you can sort of see a throughput from Milton Friedman's line about the rules of the game and the umpire to mechanism design, which is the area I work in. So my first day at Chicago, a few colleagues take me to lunch at a dim sum place downtown. And looking back, I was just thinking a few minutes ago at this set of colleagues, one of them turned out to win a Nobel Prize. One won the Clark Medal, so for best economist under the age of 40. One won a Genius Grant, and one just a total pain in the ass. That's my lunch table. And one of them, I won't say.
So who exactly was at lunch with you?
Right, exactly. It was actually one guy. No, it's four. I'll tell you later.
Say first.
Yeah, right. No, but so one of them asked me this. So this market design business you're engaged in, and they just hired me, by the way. I'm their brand new assistant professor. This market design business you're engaged in, isn't it all bunk? What do you need economists for to study the design of auction mechanisms or to study the design of market mechanisms? Won't firms figure it out for themselves? So what do you need the government to design the right way to allocate spectrum using a complicated auction format? Why not just invoke the Coase theorem? Why not just allocate property rights and let the market kind of sort itself out? So my first day at lunch, they're already giving me a hard time about my area of research, which I think kind of gives you a sense of the Chicago School as more of a Chicago combativeness approach, love of ideas, which we'll come back to. But let me talk about one specific line of research in market design that I'm proud of and want to talk about. I think it kind of sets up my own relationship with some of these big Chicago School ideas, and it's research on the design of financial markets. And I started this research in 2010, just after one of my colleagues said, you got to find big questions to study. So I figured if I'm going to study market design, the design of financial markets is about as big as it gets. And I was struck by this arms race for trading speed that was starting to get a lot of attention in the press and on some more obscure blogs. And I kept digging into this and ultimately concluded with colleagues that the arms race for trading speed is an outgrowth of an underlying structural flaw in the design of modern financial exchanges. And this structural flaw, which I'll come to in a moment, leads to a never-ending race for trading speed and makes markets less liquid and more expensive to use than would a better designed market. In an empirical study, I'll come to the theory in a moment, but an empirical study that I conducted jointly with researchers at the UK Financial Conduct Authority, so US-UK relationship, this was published in 22 in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, we found that 20% of trading volume in the UK stock market took place in high-frequency trading races, the typical race taking just 5 to 10 millionths of a second, and that the tax that trading races put on liquidity accounts for 17 to 33% of the market's cost of liquidity, depending on which empirical measure you use. And races were also very concentrated, as a point I've talked about with Luigi. The top 6 firms in our data winning over 80% of all trading races. And we estimated that latency arbitrage, this kind of arms race for trading speed, is about a $5 billion a year issue in global equity markets, let alone all of the different kinds of financial instruments that trade on limit order books of bonds, certain kinds of bonds, currencies, options, futures, and so forth. My earlier work published in 2015, probably the work that got me tenure here, identified the underlying conceptual problem theoretically and showed how to fix it with a market design reform we called frequent batch auctions. So in a nutshell, put time into tiny units, like a tenth or even a thousandth of a second, and then let algorithms or other market participants compete on price instead of on speed within these very frequently conducted auctions. Or we're used to in financial markets that prices come in units in lots of financial markets, like stocks trade in a penny or treasury bonds trade in a 16th. But when markets transitioned from human-based markets and trading pits, like in downtown Chicago, to electronic markets run fully in server farms, we forgot to put time into units too. And what frequent batch auctions do is, one, they make tiny speed differences among trading firms not matter anymore. It doesn't matter if you're a millionth of a second faster than the next guy if the market clears once a second. And then two, the auction changes the nature of the game. It changes the nature of competition from competition on speed to be a tiny bit faster than the next guy to react to a price signal to competition on price. And this protects market participants from trading at a price that just became stale. So all participants trade at a market auction price. So in the part of this research that was most closely connected, I think, to the big Chicago school ideas, published just this past year in the Journal of Political Economy, I asked the question, will the market fix the market? So will market forces naturally lead financial markets, and specifically financial exchanges, to adopt a different market design that solves some of the issues around high-frequency trading, or would some sort of regulatory intervention be necessary to address the issue? And I think this "Will the Market Fix the Market" paper is certainly where my own inner dialogue with the big Chicago ideas was the loudest, because on the one hand, I think we're all inclined by nature to favor market-based solutions where possible. But on the other hand, I want to make 3 points. So one is, there was a lot of incumbent rent, what economists call rent, in the status quo, and specifically high-frequency trading firms, of course, but also exchanges from selling fast access, and the big investment banks from helping their clients navigate a very complicated equity market structure, made a lot of money from the complicated and speed-sensitive status quo. Second, the harms from the issue were very dispersed. So we actually had this classic Mansur-Olson issue of concentrated interests on one side of the problem, on one side of the debate, and very dispersed interests on the other side of the debate. And then third, it's kind of a fantasy and a caricature to just ignore the regulator altogether, because financial markets are highly regulated for good reason. And what my work was arguing was that markets would work better if the regulations were slightly different. So I gave a talk once, and I'll close on this, where one of our alums, who's a billionaire quant hedge fund manager, I gave a talk on my research, and I had 45 minutes to talk. At minute 43, he takes the floor and says, "I wasn't expecting to say this, but you're actually not a communist." And then he went on to say that you're not saying this isn't about more versus less regulation. This is markets need rules to flourish, and you're saying the rules should be different. And then they gave me some fancy prize. It was one of my professional highlights. So I think my research has always been in dialogue with these big ideas about what's the role of the market, what's the role of the government, what are the right rules of the game. It sometimes shows up in big issues like the design of financial markets, sometimes in much smaller stuff like how to sell Taylor Swift tickets. But I think we're all engaged in this in this kind of work. And with that, let me kind of turn to the panel part, or the crosstalk part of this this discussion. I guess we've talked a lot already about the Chicago, not quite the Chicago school, but the Chicago mentality or Chicago approach. But I wonder if you think there is currently a Chicago school, or if it's more the approach and mentality and fierceness that we've already discussed.
Well, I mean, let me jump in on what Luigi was talking about data, which I just wholeheartedly agree with what he's saying. And I think that I like to think that at Chicago, we really do strike a balance between data and frameworks that I think is hopefully exactly at the right point, because I think 30 years ago, people started to recognize, I mean, you hear these statistics now, they're just like crazy. I think Hal Varian at Google used to give these statistics about how much data is generated every day relative to, like, you could go from the, from the 9th century to the 14th century, and about the same amount of data is produced in one day as was produced. These kinds of numbers are just mind-boggling. And so you quickly get the impression that you can just end up drowning in data if you don't have frameworks. And I think that's something that I think I've been very interested to see as we go through. I mean, Luigi has been an expert at this, right? Because Luigi can say he's all about data, but I mean, Luigi is a top-notch conceptual thinker, right? And so trying to strike that balance, so I'll just give you an example of something I've been thinking a lot about, is the production side, right? Where we have these views on how production works. Production is a function of capital and labor. And when you start looking at the data with that framework, a few things jump out at you right away. So I love this work by a woman named Teresa Ford, who's at Dartmouth, who's been using census establishment level data, the best data really out there for understanding production in the US. And she basically makes the point that I find so fascinating, which is companies like Nike and Apple actually don't have a single manufacturing establishment in the US, right? I think we would all agree, we have the iPhone in our pocket, we would call Apple a manufacturing firm to some degree. They manufacture this product we all buy, and yet they don't have a single establishment in the US that does any manufacturing. And she makes the point that when the BEA does their GDP value added, they do it for domestic value added, and they do it at the establishment level. And so I don't know how many people know what we classify the establishments of Apple and Nike as. In the US, we classify them actually as wholesale trade firms, right? Which I think all of us would say that doesn't seem to make sense. They're not wholesale trade firms. And I'm getting into this because it then really kind of strikes you that what are a lot of US production doing? US production, I think, is really at the very beginning of the value. Now, I want to be clear, there's a huge amount of domestic value added of Apple and Nike, right? We all agree with that. So at the front end, they design, right? And at the back end, they do sales and marketing, right? And I think these two functions have now become a huge fraction of the value add of the production sector of the United States. And how does that fit into the production sector mentality? Like, how does that fit back into the conceptual framework? When we think F equals, Y equals FKL, like, where is design and where is where is sales and marketing? And there's a huge literature on intangible capital, which then intersects very strongly with some of the issues Luigi's thinking about, which is when we talk about rents, concentration, profits, how does it relate to this general change in the way the production function's working? So my wife is always getting all of these mailing things in the mail for companies that produce clothing, and they're always like the same, right? Like, one of the ones that's hit it big is a company called Viore that some of you may hit, or Lululemon is the old one, right? And it's all of these things you get, and it's kind of, you look at them, all the clothes are produced in Vietnam or China or somewhere else. And it's all about a mentality or a lifestyle they're selling you. And I was just thinking to myself that this just looks like a lottery. There's like 100 of them. A couple of them are going to hit it big, maybe because my kids are going to be on Instagram and TikTok with it. And then they're going to be super profitable, right? And I started thinking, like, in certain enough, venture capitalists actually fund a huge number of these companies. And so once you start thinking about the framework, the data, how they interact, it kind of opens up a way of looking at very classic questions like, is there market power? Is there concentration? And I think that's what we try to do at Chicago, is to always stay wedded to the data, but also make sure we have the main conceptual frameworks that help us guide what the most interesting questions you can answer with that data are.
We must be of the same generation because I use Lululemon t-shirts as one of my teaching examples.
Yeah.
And use it as a way of teaching about if there's a pile of rent and then you get a lot of entry to try to capture the rent. And then actually Google extracts a lot of the in a useful way, but I don't want to get off track on a debate at Google, but extracts a lot of the value from that by selling access to the customer through their advertising auctions.
By the way, my 18 and 15-year-old boys would tell you we are definitely in the wrong generation, because if you say Lululemon to them, they're like, "Oh, come on, Lululemon." It's
exactly.
It's about, So.
And I also like to say to the students that it sounds so serious to be data-driven, but you can't be data-driven without a conceptual framework. You need some theory too. And then I get frustrated by we're going to end up disagreeing a lot. I get frustrated by some of the excessively technical theory that gets divorced from or detached from data and reality. But the best economics research combines clear conceptual thinking, whether it's theory with a capital T or just simpler with looking out to the world and to the world of data.
So if you ask me what is sort of the characteristic of the Chicago School, besides what Amir has already said, I think that the other characteristic is that we subject our discussion always to the so-called nirvana fallacy test. The nirvana fallacy, I don't know whether it's Coase or Demsetz, but one of the two raised this point, that economists tend to compare market imperfections with perfect government. And not just bad economists, all economists. And it says, I was reading the latest book by Stiglitz. He's the paramount example of that. He goes on and on about all market imperfection, and boom, the government comes in and solves everything. And this is maybe because I'm Italian, but my view of the government is not as perfect as the one of Joe Stiglitz. And even as now living in the United States, I realize that not even the United States works anymore. Maybe in Sweden, maybe if you're Swedish, you can be sort of socialist because the government works well. But any other country, that's not the case. So I think that is, to me, the stuff with the staying power. Let's be a bit controversial and move forward, where I think that the traditional Chicago School, at least the Chicago School as of the late 70s, is wrong, is precisely where Eric is working. The fact that markets naturally evolve toward an efficient outcome with no intervention brought anywhere. And I think that this is not common to the entire sort of liberal society. In fact, inside the Mont Pelerin society, there was a bitter fight between, let's call it the neoliberal and the ordoliberal, that are mostly German, but I think Harry Simons was an ordoliberal. They said, no, you need to have a state that has some power to set the rules, because without the rules, markets don't work. And I think that the fascinating aspect, there is a kind of a sexy finance element to your work, Eric, but from a big picture point, the really important point is to say, look, don't assume that just competition among institutions will deliver an efficient outcome. And this is extremely, extremely important these days, because we are approaching a world where you can create your own institution. And it says that there are these crazy people. One is Rothbard. Another is actually the son of Milton Friedman, David Friedman, who are so-called anarcho-capitalists. And the anarcho-capitalists have this view that you should let complete freedom, competition, even among sort of different states. And people can pick the states they want, they can pick the rules they want. And it sounds like nirvana for libertarian. And in fact, this is exactly what people in Silicon Valley adopt, whether they know it or not, to the point of that economist. But underlying there is this idea that this is going to bring perfect freedom. And they don't understand that that competition for rules has to take place in a market with a particular structure. And if you have platforms competing with each other, that market is not intrinsically competitive. And what you have a lot of distortions. And I think Eric is one of the first to show this result empirically. I think that this result is enormously important for the debate we have now. Can we let competition among platforms drive our life? Because each platform is a state to some extent with its own role. At some point, Mark Zuckerberg said, I have the state of Facebook, and it was also trying to print his own money. And that will make it short of having an army. But, if you look at the Pope, he has a state and no army. So it's impossible to have a state with no army as long as you have enough power on other dimensions. So long story short, I think that I think the new Chicago school, or the new incarnation of the Chicago school, differs, in my view, dramatically from the old one, is precisely on this point, which seems small, but in fact is gigantic. Now, the tension, and a tension that has not been resolved, that's the reason why we're still working very hard on this, is how do you reconcile this with the fact that governments tend to be captured by vested interest and then distorted and so on and so forth. So there is not a clean intellectual solution. In a sense, I think that Friedman and Stigler compromise on the substance because they wanted to have a clean theoretical framework. So if you go to complete laissez-faire of institutions, I think that is very clean theoretically, but in practice, as Eric shows, doesn't work. And then the question is how to reconcile the two.
So how do you, something I've struggled with since I got here 15 years ago is how do you, so contrasting graduate school with here at University of Chicago. In graduate school, identify the market failure, fix the market failure. What is the policy solution or the market design solution that will fix the policy failure? Come to Chicago, you say, well, fixing the policy failure isn't enough because governments are flawed too. But how do you avoid descent into nihilism, where markets are imperfect, government's imperfect, nothing quite? I mean, it's kind of easy to kind of yell at. We're all yellers in different ways, different dispositions, but you're probably the loudest. It's kind of, they can point at concentrated market power. You can point at captured regulators or captured government officials. How do you avoid? I guess it's a question for all of us, but how do you avoid descent into a nihilism of nothing works and have a disposition towards how do we make this system of imperfect markets and imperfect government work better?
Actually, the way I try to escape the nihilism that I agree is a natural tendency is to actually rediscover the virtue of democracy. Because in a sense, capture is a distortion of representatives in democracy. And so the more you make democracy work at various stages, the more you can fix that. And to some extent, one of the ideas, I got it actually from the crypto world. As you know, the way to make something not corruptible is that in order to change a rule, you have to corrupt everybody. And if you corrupt everybody, you basically reach a cosine solution, which is the one you want. And so if you have, and of course, there are friction in democracy doesn't work, but I think that understanding that democracy is an integral part of a competitive market, because competitive markets needs rules, and rules can be fair if you want, or can be efficient if you are an economist, only if you have a sufficient democratic system. So that's to me, the closure, and that's the reason why I quoted those passages, because to me, this integral component is important, an integral component that was not fully recognized, I think, by Friedman, for example.
I mean, one thing I'm going to say on that front is just, I think that this is one place where I probably depart from the Chicago school, and I'd like to see it change in a way, which is, I think once you go from being positive to normative, when you're really thinking about policy, when you're really thinking about what we should do as the government or whatnot, and I think Luigi's been excellent at this because he's so well steeped in political economy and thinking of the way governments work. But I do think sometimes economists need some modesty in learning from other fields. Like, I think that whenever you get to the actual policy questions that you need to focus on, like, whether we should restrict free trade. Obviously, we have a very strong view on that, and I kind of subscribe to that. But it's hard to ignore the evidence from sociologists, from political economists, from psychologists on like the importance of people working and how it affects their mental health. I mean, we need to be like cognizant of the fact that we are one discipline in many disciplines. And I think we need to be a little bit disparaging of other disciplines sometimes in terms of what they're bringing to the table. When we kind of go into answering policy questions. Sometimes people ask me policy questions and I'm like, that's for a philosopher, a theologian, or a psychologist. Like there's so many elements of what it takes to get the right policy that I think we as economists at Chicago sometimes overstep our boundaries in terms of thinking through where we could be learning from other disciplines that have different ways of thinking. Now, that being said, like I sat on the University of Chicago press board and saw books from all different types of disciplines, and I do probably share a lot of the views of many economists in which I generally am like, oh, they're just not doing it right in that field, right? So I think we have that tendency, but we do have to try to find what we think is doing well in these other disciplines and try to implement them into our policy solutions.
I completely agree. I think that the great things about the Chicago school is that went outside of economics. The bad thing was that had an imperialistic attitude going outside, and now we are more in a fair trade exchange. And I think that Dick Taylor represents actually a fair trade exchange. And I think there is so much more that we can do because reality is complex. And now the other fields have become much better, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think it might be a good time to bring in some questions from the audience, and we've got a microphone that we can pass around the room, and then we'll interject more as we go. But please go ahead.
Good morning, Parker Hudson, 1968 LSE. Quick historic comment, and then a question for you guys. The historic comment is that at LSE in 1968. Harry Johnson ran the crowd, and every day they reminded us that they were from the Chicago school. So whatever it was, we were getting it straight from Chicago. There were no computers, no handheld calculators, anything we had to do with data. We had to literally put it pencil and paper, and figure something out. But these guys would lecture us in the morning and then go be the advisors to the Macmillan and the conservative government, the shadow government, because in the morning, the main government under Harold Wilson was very Keynesian, so they came down from Cambridge and told the government what to do, and then our professors from the Chicago school would go in the afternoon and tell the shadow government what to do. A little bit of history. Question. We hear so much that the level of debt and our deficits is unsustainable, which from just a common sense point of view, you would think sounds pretty accurate. My question is, what will that look when it becomes unsustainable? What will it look like? What are some real world consequences for households, for markets when we actually hit unsustainability or we go past it?
I think that's Jim's.
Yeah,
Jim Paterva's talk right after is going to be 100% focused.
Yeah.
You have to wait an hour.
In the spirit of humility, we defer to our colleague 20 feet from us.
I was very interested in your reference to Milton Friedman. People forget that actually for him, economic freedom was a huge tie to political freedom, and it was a political position. And I think implicit in it, going to Luigi's point, was some idea that too much monopoly is bad. And so there's a political freedom element to that as well as an economic element. And then tying to Eric's point about what do you do about it? Well, Lina Khan is trying to change the way we practice antitrust law. And so I'd be interested in, and there's a kind of whole new set of ideas in the antitrust area. Maybe there's too much monopoly now. Maybe the nature of monopolies with Google and the like has changed. I'd just be interested in your thoughts on this subject, which seemed to be a very topical one.
Yes.
So I'm proud to say that Lina Khan spoke at the Stigler Conference on Antitrust in 2018 and was on my podcast in 2018 when she was fresh out of graduate school. So I'm very sympathetic to those ideas. I think that actually my fear is that they've reached government a little bit too early because they've not formed a coherent alternative paradigm. So the fact that the consumer welfare standard is not enough, I think is well accepted, and people are started to think about alternative. And I am very sympathetic to what Lina Khan is trying to do. I think that they're struggling because you only beat a theory, back to the framework, you only beat a theory with another theory, and the other theory they have is not as well thought out. And so my fear is that they might lose in court, and not only because they are conservative judges, but because their arguments are not sharp enough. So I think there is a desperate need of alternative theory, and part of what I'm trying to promote with this regular Stigler conference on antitrust is precisely to create alternative. And one thing, speaking of the Chicago openness, is the conference in 2000, I think it was 2017, was the first conference in which the so-called neo-Brandesian were talking with the establishment. And there was a bit of a tension in the room because generally they were not in the same circles. And they speak a little bit of a different language. But I think I'm very proud that I brought in the same room, because I think that progress can only be achieved by bringing people in the same room and moving forward.
Jim?
Yeah, I mean, thank you all for a really stimulating discussion. And Luigi, I was very glad that you brought in the kind of, I call the role of the market and the presumption there. So if I were going to characterize the Chicago school of Milton and George and Gary, it would be sort of a presumption that the market gets it right, and a pretty high standard to demonstrate that there's any reason for intervention, right? And that view with the satellite institutions at UCLA and Rochester and similar places, you could kind of tell in the economics profession of 40 years ago where that sort of stream of intellectual view ran strong and not. And it kind of was a counterbalance to many other places, including MIT, where government intervention was kind of taken as the role of the social planner was to figure out how to improve on what the market would deliver. And I'm curious, as Amir has spoken about more openness, and Luigi, you've spoken about a nuanced view on some of these topics, whether you think that there has been a bit of a change over time, from all of your ability to look back over these few decades, so that the sort of push for resist the temptation to intervene has weakened. And I think back to something like the George and Milton writing on roofs versus ceilings, and very clearly saying, look, rent control is a mistake. Let the market deliver here. But it provided sort of an end point to the discussion that was, here's the sort of Chicago pro-markets view, and then here's all the rest, which is saying intervene. But is that stream running less rapidly today? Has it just become more nuanced over time? How do you think about that kind of a push?
Well, let me try to jump in. I think that what's changed a lot is, I think when you're living in a world in which data analysis and empirical analysis is still pretty nascent, we would say, in terms of where it was at the time these arguments were being made, then I think there's a little bit more of a tolerance for starting with the big question, which is, should the government intervene or not in this market, and coming up with kind of an ideological umbrella that you tend to fit in, which is, in general, we're going to say markets work pretty well and have a high threshold. I think with the advent of data and empirical analysis, especially what I would call the youngish generation, if you start with that kind of ideological predisposition, which is just in general, we're going to be skeptical of government intervention, I think you get massive pushback, because people say, well, look, tell us what market you're studying, tell us the way it's structured, tell us what the data say. And so I just think that there's kind of a pushback right away to anything that's being framed with the policy going front and center. That as a general principle, we're going to view the government skeptically, or as a general rule, we're going to view the government favorably. And I think, youngish people, which, I'm almost 48 now, so I don't know if I still fit in that category, but
You were a Lululemon, right?
yeah. I mean, we're a Lululemon generation apparently over here. But I think that it's oftentimes viewed as, wait, you've come to some conclusion that is now going to shade all of the work you do. And it can be as dramatic as like, I'm not going to even trust the work you do now because I'm not sure it's being done in the ground up kind of way. Now, the world is such that we can never really do things from purely ground up. All of us come in with our frameworks and our ways of thinking in general principles. But I guess if I would try to summarize what I'm saying is on the general principle versus let me try to build up from the ground, we're a little bit more towards building up from the ground before we come up with broad umbrella kind of policy views on how we're going to view the government. So for me, for example, I am with Luigi that I'm always worried that the government is just another player and that we got to think very carefully about government intervention for that reason. But on a positive perspective, I'm very happy to look at certain markets, as Eric has done, and say like, okay, there are real problems with just trying to let the market work in this market. But that doesn't then necessarily inform my view on another market. And so I think you don't want to get too specialized, but I think you do want to be careful about making general statements all the time that I think some of the people did 30 or 40 years ago.
We can descend into the, it depends. It always depends on the context of the specific, and then to rising back up to this big picture level is not the natural disposition of the way our journals work and profession works. But
that's a good point. Yeah, it really shows up in the journals, and I mean, editors are not going to take papers that like make outlandish claims without really supporting evidence. So,
but I would say that there was almost an absolute presumption in the old days that markets get it right, and I think that absolute presumption is untenable today, in part for the work like your work, Eric, etc., that shows that markets often get it wrong. And so I think that the tendency is to challenge whether the market get it right, and then to challenge whether the government can do better. That's the nirvana fallacy, but not to have an absolute belief. The other thing, and maybe this is my personal bent versus is very important to distinguish what I call the pro-market position from the pro-business position, because a lot of the Chicago rhetoric play very well in the interest of the business community. Not all of it, but some of it. And then was really broadcasted very heavily as a lobbying tool. And I think it's very important to recognize that and to separate very clearly what is a position in favor of competition in markets and what is a position in favor of the interest of producers who might be very influential, but is not necessarily what we want. And last but not least, I think there is much more interest in distribution. I think that one of the characteristics of the old Chicago school is that distribution really did not matter. And we know it matters in many ways. And we're much more attentive to that.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you very much, Amir and Luigi. I love we're so grateful to have you as colleagues just down the hall. And let me turn it over to Nell, who will introduce the next panel. Thank you.